welcome back. So today I want to talk about the simple cash conversion cycle, or the simple business cash cycle. Businesses normally require a cash resource with which to start. Even a street trader uses this cash resource, and he leaves it in the business because he knows he cannot take this resource out. In fact, you can call this resource his working capital. So he knows he needs to leave this money in the business. Every day he will buy his goods and bring them to market using this cash resource. So let us go back and have a look at this business that my friend had. If you recall, this business went bankrupt, and yet have a look at the figures here. So when I asked people what they think happened in this business, I got many different answers, none of which were the real reason. Some said the sales never happened as it was depicted. Others felt that the costs were far higher than what he had planned. Some even felt that the overhead costs here were far more than shown. The truth is, none of these reasons were the real cause. In order to understand the real cause, we'll have to look at a simple business. We need to know how finances affect the outcomes within this business. And it's best to start with a simple business where you can see all the elements easily. For this example, I'm going to use a kitchen cabinet maker. This kitchen installer I will call George. And he started a business installing kitchen cabinets. Now, how it came about was as follows. He started renovating his own kitchen, and this cost him about 80,000. You can attach any currency you feel comfortable working. The cost of this renovation was 80,000. George was very proud of what he achieved, and he showed his friend, and his friend was also impressed. And so his friend asked him, "George, can't you install a similar kitchen in my house? I will even pay you for it." "How much did you say this one cost?" And George told him 80,000, and he said, "Okay, I will pay you 100,000. So that means you're going to make 20,000 profit." So George did this over the next couple of months because he had a steady job still, and he was employed by an employer, and he had to do this over the weekends and in the evenings. And when he finished, his friend gave him the 100,000 as promised. So George realized he'd made 20,000 on this project. And this got him thinking. He saw an opportunity here for himself. He felt he could install 4 kitchens a month. And based on these calculations and what happened in this example, he was going to make 80,000 a month, because 4 kitchens at 20,000 profit each would give him 80,000. This was a little bit more than what he was earning already. George also had another family member that was in the construction business. This family member had won a contract for the installation of 25 units over the next 6 months. And he offered George the opportunity to put 25 kitchens, 1 in each of these units. They expected their business to grow, and they felt that there was sufficient work for George to install 1 kitchen a week over the next 2 years. So George took this opportunity, and that's often what happens. A business opportunity starts off as a sideline hobby or an interest, and it becomes more and more, and the person realizes they can actually earn money from this, and they end up venturing into a business. So what really happens in a typical business like George's? Let us explore what happens in this kind of business, and using George's scenario, I will build on what are all the steps that take place and how the monies flow through such a business. Step 1 is resources are acquired for cash. So this would mean that George had to have 80,000 put aside for him to start this business. We could put this money into a container or representative container or bucket so that we can see where the money is to start with. The second step in this process is that this cash is then converted into the raw materials or the raw resources with which to build this kitchen. So the 80,000 is converted into raw resources. These resources could be various forms. It could be the wood for the cabinets, it could be the countertops, it could also be some of the appliances, and even the hinges and the door handles. Step 3 in the process is where George would have to convert these raw materials into a finished good, and we call this a production process. So these resources of 80,000 Rand would go into this production process where George would measure, cut, size, fix hinges, attach door handles, etc. So it really entails the making of these kitchen cabinets. We call this production process the work in process area of the business. Step 4 in the process would represent the finished goods. That is where George would actually assemble the different manufactured goods and go and implement it in the customer's kitchen. Once George had completed the finished goods, or the kitchen, he would then receive the 100,000 back from the customer. Now this 100,000 that he receives represents two elements. It represents the original 80,000 that he invested in the resources, and then the 20,000 profit that he made. Now obviously, if George is going to go and make another kitchen next week, he couldn't take this 80,000 out of the business. He would leave that in the business. This is the same way a street trader leaves their cash resource in their business. So they only extract the profit element. We call this cash that moves around these 4-step processes the working capital. That resource that is utilized in the business to make the next finished goods and to then present that to market so that market pays for it. So in this scenario, if George received 100,000, he could take 20,000 for himself and utilize that as salary, and the other 80,000 would stay in order to acquire the resources for the next kitchen. So we could represent these 4 steps in a logic model, and each of the steps would then be put into a container. So we'd have a container here for the cash in the beginning, where the cash was received. This doesn't mean that there was a pile of cash lying in this container. It could be in the bank account, but the reservoir or the bucket or container represents where the money is lying at that point in time. So the 80,000 is lying in cash. In the first step, at 80,000 would then move over to the raw materials, and then in the following step, the 80,000 would move into the work in process. So the 80,000 would leave the raw material container and go into the work in process container. And then in the final stage, the work in process money or value would move across to the finished goods container. It's only when the goods are sold or ownership changes hands that the profit comes into this game. So that means up until that point of receiving the income or the 100,000, 80,000 is what is invested in any of these containers at a point in time. Now, these containers represent assets or things the business owns. So the business owned 80,000 Rand in the beginning. And if we drew up a report, which is called a balance sheet, which shows the assets and what or things the business owns and what the business owes to people, we would see 80,000 lying in this cash reservoir or 80,000 in the bank. And it would represent 80,000 worth of assets for the business. Now, when that money got converted into raw materials, the cash reservoir would empty. So the 80,000 would leave that reservoir and it would then be invested in the raw material reservoir. That means the business is still worth 80,000. And that makes logical sense because George didn't make money by converting the cash into raw material. The value of the raw materials would have been what he paid for them, the 80,000. Similarly, when he took the 80,000 from the raw materials and he went and put it in his production process, and if we had to draw up a balance sheet at that point in time, then George's assets would be worth the 80,000 Rand value that is lying in the work in process bucket. He wouldn't have made money at that point in time. Now, when he converted that to the finished good, or the finished kitchen, and he went and installed it, the value of that kitchen in George's eyes would still be 80,000. It would only convert to 100,000 once the customer had paid him. So once he delivered the kitchen, the item became worth 100,000 because he got 100,000 back in cash. And that should make logical sense to you. In summary, the goods or resources, therefore, are worth 80,000, whether they're found in the raw material bucket, or they've moved on into work in process, or they've moved on into finished goods, it's still worth 80,000 to that business. The actual value only increases upon the receipt of the income. So these assets or items that he owns, the raw material at a point in time, or the work in process at a point in time, or the finished goods at a point in time, keep the same value. And we call these assets working capital. It's the money or the value that we are working with in the business. And that should be fairly clear from the story. This is an important point. Accounting records transactions at their historical cost. When George acquired the raw materials, we wouldn't record it at the anticipated selling price of 100,000, we would record it at the 80,000, the value that the goods that came in got received. This process, going through these 4 steps, is called the cash conversion cycle. It represents the path that the goods or the value takes from starting out as cash until it becomes cash again. Hence the word cash conversion cycle, because the cash converted from cash to resources, resources to work in process to finished goods, and finished goods then becomes cash again. The 4 buckets in this process are all assets, are all things the business owns. The asset carries the value of what went into that bucket, not what went out, what went into that bucket. Now, interesting, once a sale has been made and George has received 100,000, the working capital at that point in time is worth 100,000 because the profit is still lying. Now, if he took that profit out, it would then reduce back to 80,000. If he left it in, it would be 100,000. This is another interesting point, because if he leaves money in and he goes and buys the next kitchen's raw material, his working capital would be 100,000. Why is it? Well, the 80,000 is what he paid for the raw materials. The other 20,000 would remain in the cash reservoir. And we add these 4 buckets together to work out what the working capital is worth. So 20,000 would be lying in his cash resource bucket, and 80,000 would be lying in his raw material bucket. If he's halfway through that process in the next week, he would still have the 20,000 in his cash bucket, and he would have 80,000 in the bucket or container showing the work in process. His working capital would be the 2 items added together. So working capital is that value of what is running around in this business's cash conversion cycle. Similarly, if he left that money in the business again at the end of the 2nd week, and again at the end of the 3rd week, and again at the end of the month, he would have ended up with working capital of 160,000. This is made up of the 2 elements, 80,000 being what he originally bought of raw materials, and the other 80,000 is made up of the cash profit that he hasn't extracted out of the business yet. In accounting, we have to create annual financial statements. And among these statements is this report called the balance sheet report. And I will go into more detail in this later. But if we draw up an accounting balance sheet at this point in time, at the end of the month, where George has left in the profits from the 4 kitchens, and he's left in his working capital that he started with to acquire resources, his working capital would be worth 160,000. It means that his balance sheet would have increased or doubled in size to what it was when he started out. That is an important phenomenon. The balance sheet report shows what the entity owes to other people, and in George's case, it doesn't owe anybody anything, and it owns 160,000. So that is the other element, and the 2 sides must always equal each other. In the next part of this course, we'll explore this phenomenon a bit more, and we'll also start seeing what are the effects when we start selling on credit.